Welcome to episode 5. Today we will be jumping right into some heavy topics. First up, we'll be talking about the book Bad Therapy. Then I'll be jumping into some of my own experiences, and we'll end off with some random reactions. Let's get started. For this segment of Cultural Conversations, we will be discussing Abigail Shrier's book, Bad Therapy. As you can tell, I have lots of markings in this book. There are so many meaningful moments and meaningful conversations that she shares throughout this book. Overall, this was a great read and I would highly recommend it. Abigail Shrier speaks to professionals in the field and she demonstrates the difference between effective therapy and ineffective therapy. She pointedly describes the negative effects of our propensity to jump children into therapy services they do not really need. The most meaningful part of this book is the questioning of narratives we are shamed out of questioning. In our culture, you aren't supposed to question therapists. You aren't supposed to question experts. You aren't supposed to question science. In this book, everything can be questioned, as it should. Even under the assumption that therapy is in general good, no one should be going into therapy by throwing caution to the wind. There are many topics addressed in this book. I will discuss a few of my favorite moments in the book. The first is from a chapter titled Iatrogenesis. At one point in this chapter, she likens mental health care to physical health care. Here's a brief excerpt. With interventions, a good rule of thumb is don't go in for an x-ray if you don't need one. Don't expose yourselves to the germs of the ER just to say hello to your doctor friend. And just maybe, don't send your kid off to therapy unless she absolutely requires it. Everyone knows the first two. It's the last one that may surprise you. She describes specific studies and scenarios where symptoms are worsened by therapy or interventions, even when the patient might report otherwise. One of the most excellent qualities of this book is the extensive expertise. No claim is made unqualified. There is always a supporting study or an interview with an expert in the field or someone with personal experience. Very often, more than one of those things. One of my other favorite moments is from a chapter called Trauma Kings. This chapter contained one of the biggest surprises for me. Shrier describes a study conducted by Wyndham. She recruited 908 children who had been abused and matched them with 667 other children who had not been abused by similar characteristics. She followed them into adulthood and found that parents who had been abused as children were no more likely to physically abuse their own children. This surprised me. I have read or heard so many times that children who suffer abuse are more likely to become abusive themselves. And this is a great case to highlight the importance of quality research. This is another aspect that brings this book to the next level. Abigail Shrier understands the difference between effective and ineffective research. We live in a trust the science culture that simultaneously pressures researchers into producing publishable research. A study like Wyndham's, one that follows children into adulthood, cannot be done in a few years. It is time-consuming research that requires patience and resources. Much research is done with a smaller timetable and with more pressure to have interesting results. People want to publish studies that explain why something has happened or have statistically significant results, rather than studies showing there is no correlation. As such, much valid research stays out of the public eye. This book does an excellent job of taking moments to explain relevant parts of the research process, something everybody needs to have a greater understanding of. And in this book, my absolute favorite chapter title is called Spare the Rod, Drug the Child. Spare the Rod, Drug the Child is a very provocative title, but it sparks those questions that we are not allowed to ask. I hope you can see Bad Therapy is saturated with meaningful content. It is not provocative just for the sake of raising a ruckus, but rather to draw attention to an area where many experts are failing our children. This book is an excellent read. Not only is this book full of great content, but it's actually enjoyable to read. I read this book while traveling, on a plane, in an airport, lots of noises and distractions, but it was really enjoyable so I could just focus and enjoy the content of the story. And it didn't take me very long to read. I didn't feel like I was drudging through a bunch of research. She writes it in a way that makes you able to connect with her thought process, connect to our culture, and understand how these ideas are playing out in our world. So I strongly recommend that you get your own copy. And now that you know a little bit more about the content of the book, I'd like to share with you how some of my own experiences relate to some of the things she talked about. So let's get personal. There are several ways my own experiences tie into the content of Bad Therapy, but I want to just discuss two of them. While Abigail Shrier doesn't specifically talk about IEPs, she does talk about diagnosing and accommodating, and this often plays out through IEPs. So I used to work as a high school teacher for many years, and I've taught many students who have an IEP. If you aren't familiar with that phrase, IEP, that means an individualized education plan. This is meant to help students learn the material, even if they have some sort of disability, which could be a physical impairment or a learning disability. Many people think IEPs provide temporary help, that if a student is struggling, they are put on a plan where they are provided with temporary assistance, which they are slowly weaned off of as they learn to navigate school on their own. While for some this may be the intent of IEPs, this is rarely how they function in practice. For many students, the IEPs actually become a hindrance. The students become used to the accommodation and never want out of them. More often than not, accommodations end up being about achieving a desired grade without regard to actual learning. This is the second problem of IEPs, and in general, a huge problem in schools. Too often, the appearance of achievement is more important than actual achievement. Schools are driven by data. It's important for students to have good grades to appear to be learning, but whether or not they actually know the material is often not consequential to those making these sorts of decisions. If you are a parent, teacher, or anyone involved in teaching children, it is important that you keep the goal student learning, not student achievement, not just grades. For example, if you have a student who's nervous to speak in front of their peers, and your accommodation is to exempt them from all assignments involving public speaking, you are actively hindering that student from ever learning how to speak in front of others. How can they learn to do something that you are preventing them from doing? Think about the long-term consequences of your decisions rather than the short-term gains for their grade. Interventions and accommodations can be really useful tools that can be very helpful to students, but it requires attention to the long-term implications. Another factor in my own life that has connected with the contents of Bad Therapy is therapy that's been done in my own home, and that involves emotional learning. So as foster parents, we've experienced good therapy in our home. We had a placement where the children struggled to identify emotions and to talk about them. We actually didn't seek therapy when the placement came into our home. The children were already receiving this service, so we just kind of rolled with what was going on. Children learn emotional cues from interactions with parents when they are young. For children lacking that relationship and communication in early childhood, children who have been neglected, identifying and communicating emotions may be a skill they never picked up on. So our therapist would come once a week into our home. She worked with the children in our presence. So we were there observing and hearing her conversations. We were able to ask her questions. We continued using the same language that she used with the children in our home to help them talk about their emotions. At one point, I remember how she commented happily about the progress the children were making. She said it makes such a difference when the parents continue the work at home. And I was so surprised to hear her say that, because the thought of parents not doing the work at home had never seemed like a choice to me. Of course, we wanted the work to continue, and we wanted the children to learn the skills that they needed to learn. There was nothing particularly challenging about what she was doing or anything that we were unable to pick up on. It was simple, and we could easily see why the children needed this gap to be filled in based on their past experiences. I was reminded of this experience we had when I was reading Bad Therapy. Our therapy experience had two components that she talks about good therapy requiring. One is that there were goals. There was something that the children were actually learning, so we could see if they were achieving the goal and if at some point they would no longer need the therapy services. The children were not in therapy just to hash out emotional burdens. They were in therapy to learn skills that they didn't have. The therapist was able to see their progress. The additional component that is required for good therapy is that we as the parents were involved. Children need stable homes. If children are getting different input and advice at home than at a 1-hour therapy session, they will not benefit much from the therapy. Parents need to be involved in the conversations and provide stability and consistency to help the children to learn. So that's just a little bit from my own world and my own experiences that connected with the book Bad Therapy. There's so much content in there. So again, really recommend reading it. I'm sure that there's things from your life that you'll connect with or things that you've seen in our culture that you'll be able to relate to. But for now, let's jump into some random reactions. For today's random reaction, we're going to be watching a clip that describes communication from Elevation Church, which is Stephen Furtick's church. So I originally saw this clip just describing their dialogue and the verbiage that they use, and I've seen several different responses to it. So I went to the interview, and I just want to show you the clip that people are talking about. So let's check it out.
All the way from people who have been in our church for years, and I want them to invite people to church, all the way to people who've never heard of our church before and trying to get them to come to church, right? People who are unchurched, you might say. And so how do I talk to those two people are really different. But I'm putting a lot of my focus, energy, time, resources toward what I would call the cold audience as people far from God. And so I'm not going to say the word Calvary. I'm not going to say the word resurrection. I'm not going to say the blood of Jesus, right? I'm not going to say any of these words that make someone feel like an outsider. This is really important.
First, let me give some context. I did see part of this larger interview where she was speaking, and some of the responses to this clip are exaggerating. In context, she is referring to communication with non-Christians, such as advertisements for their church or for their service. She's not actually talking about their communication during the church service or sermons that are going on at church. However, I still believe that the ideas of this video can point us to some struggles that are happening in the church at large of America. There is such an emphasis on evangelism that the actual purpose of church too often becomes lost. Many churches are emphasizing salvation as the mission of their church. They want the lost to be saved, the far to be near, for people to encounter Jesus or experience life. But then what? If the only mission of your church is salvation, you have lost the point. Salvation is the first step. There is a whole beautiful life after that. We can also get caught up in the idea that no one should feel like an outsider. We have to realize that if we operate church this way, no one will ever feel like an insider. You cannot be an insider if there are no outsiders. Christians in a church like this will struggle with their identity. Too often they will acquiesce to culture under this notion that they must not offend anyone lest they not come to church or not come to Christ. Of course, we should not be trying to offend people, but we must recognize that Christian teaching is offensive to many people. That does not mean that we should change our message. Well, this is a wrap for this episode of The Autumn Brookman Show. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please share in the comments below. And remember to live in truth.